Moses is, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating and iconic figures in Scripture. He is remembered as the liberator of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, the lawgiver of divine instruction and the mediator between God and the people of Israel. From his miraculous infancy, being saved from the Nile waters, to the climactic moments of his life on Mount Sinai, Moses' story is filled with remarkable events. Yet a mystery shrouds his biography: the near-complete absence of information about his sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Why were the direct descendants of one of history's greatest leaders relegated to a secondary position in biblical narratives? Who were these sons, and what do we know about them? To better understand the story of Gershom and Eleazar, it is important to begin with the meaning of their names. In biblical culture, names are not mere designations. They carry profound meanings and often reflect the experience or faith of those who choose them. In the case of Gershom, the firstborn, his name means foreigner. This reflects Moses' condition when he fled Egypt to the wilderness of Midian. In Exodus 2:22, Moses explains Gershom's name, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." Eleazar, the second son, has a name equally rich in meaning. It translates to, "My God is my helper," pointing to Moses' experience of trusting God to deliver him from Pharaoh's sword and to provide safety during difficult times. These two names, Gershom and Eleazar, serve as windows into Moses' struggles and hopes during a pivotal period of his life. Gershom and Eleazar's mother was Zipporah, a Midianite woman whom Moses met and married during his exile in Midian. This union raises important questions as well. Zipporah was not an Israelite. She was the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, a people who, while having some religious connections with the Hebrews, were often seen as outsiders. Moses' relationship with Zipporah was marked by moments of tension and complexity. For instance, in Exodus 4:24-26, there is the enigmatic episode where Zipporah saves Moses from being killed by God by performing Gershom's circumcision. This brief and cryptic account highlights Zipporah's crucial role during critical moments in Moses' life and family. Nevertheless, both she and their sons remain largely peripheral to the main biblical narratives. The few moments when Gershom and Eleazar are mentioned in the Bible do not provide a comprehensive picture of their lives. In Exodus 18, we see one of the only episodes where the two are directly mentioned. After the exodus from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visits the Hebrew camp in the wilderness. He brings with him Zipporah and Moses' sons, who apparently were not present during the events of the Exodus. Exodus 18:5-6 states, "Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with Moses' sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to Moses, 'I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons.' This moment, though brief, is significant as it reveals that Moses' sons were not directly involved in the major acts of deliverance, such as the crossing of the Red Sea or the plagues in Egypt. Instead, they remained safely away from the dangers faced by the Hebrew people. The Scripture's silence regarding Gershom and Eleazar in significant events becomes even more striking when contrasted with the emphasis placed on the descendants of other biblical figures. Abraham, for instance, has much of his story centered on the divine promise of becoming the father of a great nation, with a strong focus on his son Isaac. Similarly, Jacob's lineage is meticulously detailed, with his 12 sons becoming the leaders of the tribes of Israel. In contrast, Moses' sons do not play significant roles or receive notable mentions after the episode in Exodus 18. They are absent from key moments, such as the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, the rebellion of the golden calf, and the organization of the tribes during the 40 years in the wilderness. This absence raises intriguing questions. Were Gershom and Eleazar deliberately excluded from the narratives for a specific reason? Or was their story simply deemed irrelevant to the overarching purpose of Scripture? The contrast between Moses, a central figure in the history of redemption, and his sons, who almost vanish from the biblical account, is stark. This disparity becomes even more evident when considering that the descendants of other biblical leaders, even those who committed grave errors, are often mentioned. For instance, King David's sons, such as Absalom and Solomon, have their stories thoroughly explored. Even Saul, Israel's first king, has his genealogy and descendants detailed in Scripture. The lack of prominence for Gershom and Eleazar might also be understood in light of Moses' unique role as a servant of God. Moses was not merely a political or military leader. He was the mediator of the covenant between God and Israel. This singular position may have contributed to his sons being viewed as secondary in the biblical narrative. In the Hebrew tradition, spiritual leadership was not necessarily hereditary, unlike monarchies or dynasties. Instead, God chose leaders according to his will, as demonstrated by Joshua succeeding Moses in leading the Israelites. The story of Gershom and Eleazar, while limited in detail, provides a fascinating glimpse into the familial and cultural dynamics of Moses' time. However, it also leaves many questions unanswered. Why did Moses' sons fade into obscurity? Did they choose to live on the margins of public life? Or was their story intentionally omitted to emphasize other aspects of the biblical message? These questions point to a deeper exploration of the cultural context and potential reasons behind Gershom and Eleazar's relative anonymity. Their story, though sparse, invites reflection on how Scripture focuses on God's purposes rather than the personal legacies of even its greatest figures. As we consider the lives of Gershom and Eleazar, we are reminded of the humility of Moses' role and the broader narrative of divine redemption that surpasses individual prominence. To understand the erasure of Gershom and Eleazar from biblical narratives, it is crucial to analyze the culture and tribal structure of the Hebrews during the time of Moses. Israelite society was deeply organized around tribes, clans, and patriarchal families, where leadership was not only a political aspect, but also profoundly spiritual. These structures shaped not only the organization of the people, but also the historical and religious narrative preserved in Scripture. The Hebrews were divided into 12 main tribes, each descending from the sons of Jacob. Each tribe had a distinct identity with specific responsibilities within the nation of Israel. For example, the tribe of Levi, to which Moses belonged, was tasked with priestly and religious duties. However, Moses was not merely a leader within the tribe of Levi. He transcended his tribal origin to become the mediator between God and all the people of Israel. Paradoxically, this unique position may have contributed to the erasure of his sons. Unlike figures such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are seen as patriarchal founders and leaders of lineages, Moses was not the father of a new tribe or lineage. Instead, he served as a guide and legislator, chosen by God to lead the Hebrew people from Egypt to the Promised Land. This means that even within the tribe of Levi, his position was unique and not directly passed on to his sons. In Exodus 6:16-20, the genealogy of Levi highlights Moses and Aaron as significant figures. However, Gershom and Eleazar, Moses' sons, receive no particular mention. This reflects how Moses' leadership was not tied to familial or tribal transmission, but to a divine calling. Another factor that may have influenced the absence of Gershom and Eleazar in the narrative is the origin of their mother Zipporah. In Exodus 2:21, we learn that Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, a Midianite priest. Although Jethro played a positive role in Moses' story, advising him in Exodus 18 on organizing the people, Zipporah's Midianite origin might have been viewed with suspicion by the Hebrews. In other biblical contexts, the Midianites were often considered enemies of Israel, as seen in Numbers 31:7-16, where the Israelites are ordered to destroy the Midianites. Moses' relationship with Zipporah was not without its tensions. In Exodus 4:24-26, the episode of Gershom's circumcision occurs, where Zipporah saves Moses from divine wrath by performing the ritual herself. This event underscores the cultural and spiritual complexities within Moses' own family, where Hebrew practices like circumcision were not necessarily common among the Midianites. Although Zipporah demonstrated loyalty by performing the ritual, her foreign origin could have influenced how Gershom and Eleazar were perceived within the tribal context of the Hebrews. Another fundamental aspect of Hebrew culture was the idea that leadership was not automatically passed from father to son. In Moses' case, his leadership was clearly a divine calling, as seen in Exodus 3:1-12, when God appears to him in the burning bush and calls him to liberate the Hebrews. Moses' succession did not follow a familial line. Instead, it was passed to Joshua, as recorded in Numbers 27:18-23. Joshua was chosen by God for his faithfulness and courage, not for any blood ties to Moses. This divine choice of leaders, rather than hereditary succession, reflects a central message of the biblical narrative. Spiritual authority comes from God, not from human lineages. This principle is emphasized in several instances in Scripture, such as in 1 Samuel 16:7, where God chooses David as king, stating, "Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Thus, Gershom and Eleazar may have been deliberately excluded from the narrative to reinforce the idea that spiritual leadership is a matter of divine vocation rather than descent. In contrast, other biblical figures who passed on spiritual inheritances or leadership roles to their children did not always yield positive results. Samuel, for example, was a respected prophet and judge, but his sons, Joel and Abijah, were rejected by the people for their corruption. David, another great leader, had sons like Absalom, whose rebellion nearly destroyed his kingdom. These examples illustrate that hereditary transmission of leadership was not always seen as ideal, which might have contributed to the omission of Gershom and Eleazar as Moses' successors. Additionally, the absence of Gershom and Eleazar in crucial events of Moses' story is notable. They are not mentioned during the delivery of the tablets of the law in Exodus 20, or in the many instances where Moses intercedes with God on behalf of the people. This absence suggests that they played secondary or private roles within the community, rather than serving as public figures. In Judges 18:30, there is a reference to a descendant of Gershom serving as a priest for the tribe of Dan, but this connection is debated among scholars. The absence of Gershom and Eleazar can also be interpreted as part of the theological emphasis of Scripture, which focuses more on Moses as a servant of God than as the head of a familial lineage. Moses was called to lead the people as a whole, not to establish a dynasty. This aligns with the broader biblical view, where leaders are chosen by God to fulfill specific purposes rather than to perpetuate their families in power. While the Hebrew culture and tribal structure help explain why Gershom and Eleazar were marginalized in the narrative, many questions remain. Why were their names, significant in themselves, not further explored in the Old Testament stories? Did they, like many others, simply fade from collective memory because they did not fit the central message that Scripture sought to convey? The answer may lie in the broader context of the biblical narrative, where the emphasis is less on individual figures and more on God's divine purpose for His people as a whole. These reflections lead us to explore more specific theories regarding the obscurity of Gershom and Eleazar, examining the narrative choices of Scripture and the theological implications of their silence. The lack of information about Gershom and Eleazar, the sons of Moses, has sparked discussions and speculations for centuries. The Bible mentions them only in a few brief passages, and they virtually disappear from the main narratives. Many scholars have sought to understand the reasons for this apparent erasure, by investigating both the historical context and the theological purposes of the biblical narrative. Several theories may shed light on why Gershom and Eliezer were left on the margins of history. One possible factor is the context of internal conflicts and rivalries within the people of Israel. In Exodus 2:1-10, we see that Moses was born into slavery and raised as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. This unique trajectory made Moses a leader who transcended tribal divisions, but also distanced him from any exclusive connection to a particular tribe. Unlike other leaders such as Abraham, Jacob, or David, whose leadership was firmly rooted in their family lineage, Moses lacked a clearly defined tribal affiliation. Although he was a descendant of the tribe of Levi, he played a unique and isolated role as a mediator between God and the people of Israel. This uniqueness of Moses may have contributed to the exclusion of his sons from structures of power and leadership. While the 12 tribes of Israel competed for territory, influence, and closeness to God, Gershom and Eliezer lacked a strong tribal base to support them. This absence of grounding within tribal structures might have hindered their acceptance as leaders. In Numbers 1:49-50, we see that the tribe of Levi was set apart for specific functions in the service of the tabernacle, but not for land ownership or political leadership. As the sons of Moses, Gershom and Eliezer might have been seen as part of this Levitical lineage, but without a clearly defined role. Another factor that could have influenced the marginalization of Gershom and Eliezer is the heritage of their mother, Zipporah, and Moses' connection with the Midianites. Zipporah was the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian, a people with an ambiguous relationship with Israel. In Exodus 18:1-12, Jethro is portrayed as a wise counselor who helps Moses organize the judicial system among the Hebrews. However, in other instances, the Midianites appear as adversaries of Israel. For example, in Numbers 25:1-9, the Israelites face severe consequences for engaging with Midianite women and participating in their idolatrous practices. This tension between Israel and Midian could have bred mistrust toward Gershom and Eliezer, who were direct descendants of Zipporah. Moses' connection with Midian, while positive in some respects, might have been viewed with suspicion by the Hebrew people. The circumcision of Gershom, described in Exodus 4:24-26, highlights cultural differences within Moses' family. The fact that Zipporah performed the ritual might indicate her unfamiliarity with Hebrew practices, which could have been used to question the cultural or spiritual purity of their children. Beyond the historical and cultural context, the role of Scripture in constructing the narrative must be considered. The Bible was written to convey specific spiritual messages and highlight figures and events that reinforce these teachings. Consequently, individuals who did not directly contribute to the central message were often sidelined or relegated to minor roles. As Moses' sons, Gershom and Eliezer might have been excluded from the main narrative to avoid the perception that Moses' leadership was hereditary. Moses' leadership was a divine calling, as seen in Exodus 3:1-12, where God reveals himself to Moses through the burning bush. The appointment of Joshua as Moses' successor, described in Numbers 27:18-23, underscores the idea that leadership in the biblical context was not based on family lineage, but on God's direct choice. In this light, the absence of Gershom and Eliezer in the narrative may have been intentional, emphasizing Moses' unique role and preventing disputes about his succession. There is also the possibility that the erasure of Gershom and Eliezer was a narrative decision to maintain focus on Moses' mission as the mediator of the covenant. Moses was a unique leader, chosen by God to fulfill a specific role in the history of redemption. While his sons were important as individuals, they may not have been deemed essential to the broader narrative. This approach is also evident in other biblical cases, such as the omission of details about the families of figures like Elijah and Elisha. where the emphasis is on their prophetic ministry. On the other hand, some evidence suggests that the descendants of Gershom and Eliezer might have played minor roles within the tribe of Levi. In 1 Chronicles 23:15-17, there is a mention of Moses' descendants, indicating that they were included in Levitical functions. Gershom, the firstborn, had sons who led families within the tribe of Levi, which could indicate that Moses' lineage was preserved, albeit without the prominence of other biblical figures. Another possibility is that the stories of Gershom and Eliezer were preserved in oral traditions that were lost over time. Hebrew culture highly valued oral traditions, but not all stories were recorded in Scripture. This suggests that the story of Gershom and Eliezer might have been known in specific communities, but eventually forgotten or omitted from the written accounts. Despite these theories, the erasure of Gershom and Eliezer still raises many questions. Why were the direct descendants of Moses, one of the greatest leaders in biblical history, not given more prominence? Does their absence reflect a divine purpose to emphasize Moses' uniqueness, or does it reveal tensions and rivalries within the people of Israel? These questions continue to intrigue scholars and Bible readers, prompting reflection on how history is written and preserved. The silence surrounding Gershom and Eliezer also invites us to consider other stories and characters that may have been sidelined in biblical narratives. After all, what we know about these figures often depends on the choices made by those who compiled and edited the sacred texts. The scriptures were written with a specific purpose: to reveal God's plan for humanity and highlight the events and individuals that played essential roles in that plan. However, this does not mean that lesser-known figures lacked value or importance in their time. Gershom and Eliezer may have led meaningful lives, but their omission from the main narratives reflects a focus on larger spiritual objectives. This perspective leads us to explore the nature of leadership and legacy in the biblical context. While many biblical leaders are remembered through their children and descendants, Moses is uniquely distinguished as a faithful servant whose legacy lies in the covenant between God and Israel, not in a physical lineage. This emphasis on divine mission over heredity encourages us to reflect on Moses' enduring impact and how his contributions transcended his immediate family. This idea connects us to the next topic, where we will discuss the modern impact and reflections on the erasure of Gershom and Eliezer. The story of Gershom and Eliezer, or rather its absence, offers a unique opportunity to reflect on how narratives are constructed and preserved. The erasure of their names from the Bible's main narratives is not merely a historical or theological curiosity. It is a powerful reminder that collective memory, especially when recorded in writing, is shaped by deliberate choices about what should be remembered and what will be forgotten. These choices have profound implications, both for the people of ancient Israel and for us today. The case of Gershom and Eliezer teaches us that history often reflects the power and intentions of those who write it. In the context of Scripture, we know the texts were inspired by God, but also written by human authors who organized the accounts to convey central spiritual messages. The absence of Gershom and Eliezer from the Bible's main focus seems to reinforce the idea that Moses was not just a family man or tribal leader, but a singular servant of God whose mission transcended familial ties. In Exodus 33:11, we read that the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. This verse highlights Moses' unique closeness to God and helps explain why his figure is emphasized above his sons. The erasure of Gershom and Eliezer from the central narrative may have been a deliberate choice to protect the uniqueness of Moses' role. After all, including his sons in prominent positions might have suggested that Moses' leadership was an inheritance passed from father to son, contrary to the biblical pattern of leadership based on divine calling rather than descent. The case of Gershom and Eliezer also prompts us to think about other historical, religious, or even cultural figures whose voices may have been silenced for not fitting into dominant narratives. This phenomenon is not unique to the biblical context. In virtually every culture, we find examples of individuals or groups whose contributions were ignored, erased, or minimized for political, social, or religious reasons. In many cases, narratives are shaped to reinforce specific visions of power, authority, or collective identity. For instance, in the history of other religions and traditions, we encounter significant figures who were deliberately marginalized. In early Christianity, for example, women played substantial roles as leaders and disciples, yet their stories were often obscured or reinterpreted over the centuries. In the political realm, leaders who did not align with the dominant ideologies of their time frequently had their achievements erased or rewritten. This practice, unfortunately, is a recurring human pattern. The omission of Gershom and Eliezer also challenges us to re-evaluate how we value individual roles within larger narratives. They may not have played visible or direct roles in the history of Israel's liberation, but their existence and identity still hold value. In 1 Corinthians 12:12-27, Paul describes the church as a body with many parts, emphasizing that every member has an essential role, even if it appears minor or less visible. This metaphor can be applied here, reminding us that Gershom and Eliezer, like many other minor biblical characters, have significance that may not be evident in the narrative, but still exists in God's plan. In modern times, the erasure of Gershom and Eliezer offers an opportunity to reflect on how we can recover lost or silenced stories. With advances in theology, archaeology, and critical history, we can shed more light on figures marginalized in the past. Ancient texts, inscriptions, and oral traditions can provide new perspectives on characters like Gershom and Eliezer, helping us better understand the context of their lives and their role in Israel's history. Furthermore, this story challenges us to question the narratives we accept without critical reflection. Who decides what will be remembered and what will be forgotten? What stories are we leaving behind because they don't fit the dominant narrative? These are important questions, not just for theologians and historians, but for all of us who care about understanding our past and learning from it. The erasure of Gershom and Eliezer is not just a historical mystery, it's an invitation to consider how we treat the forgotten voices in our world today. In an era of rapid information dissemination, we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to seek out stories that have been suppressed, whether for political, cultural, or religious reasons. This includes not only figures from the past, but also people in our own communities whose contributions might be overlooked. Reflecting on this story, we are reminded that Moses' role was shaped by a greater divine purpose. He was not chosen to establish a lineage of power, but to lead the people of Israel to freedom and foster a renewed relationship with God. The erasure of Gershom and Eliezer can thus be seen as part of a deliberate focus on Moses' mission and the uniqueness of his leadership. Ultimately, the story of Gershom and Eliezer invites us to consider the value of untold stories. While biblical texts do not emphasize their role, we know that as Moses' sons, they shared in the journey of one of history's greatest leaders. Their silence in the main narrative does not diminish their importance in God's greater plan. This challenges us to look beyond dominant narratives and seek a broader and more inclusive understanding of history, both in the Bible and in our modern world. We've now reached the end of this fascinating journey about Gershom and Eliezer, the sons of Moses who nearly vanished from history. While the Bible doesn't provide us with all the details, their lives offer us valuable reflections on how narratives are constructed and the role of each individual in the divine plan. If you enjoyed this content and want more videos uncovering the mysteries of Scripture, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates, and share this video with your friends. Let's continue exploring the riches of biblical history together. See you in the next video.